Poker is a game of incomplete information. Since you can't see your opponent's cards, you have to make your decisions in the hand based on the action you can see in game. Right? Well, there's more than that. In this hand, two of the best cash game players clash at some of the highest stakes online. Linus opens the hijack and ties to calls in the big blind. On the 10 high flop, Linus c-bets 75% pot, which is the solver's most preferred sizing. The hijack has a much stronger range on this flop and wants to cash in this advantage by betting big early when the board is still clean and in his favor. Generally, you want to bet bigger with your range, the more cards that can come that change the advantage. Still, there is some checking going on. Nut hands like sets and 2-pair are always bet, but then the lower we go in strength, the less often the solver likes to bet. With bottom pair being the hand class that is bet the least often. Of course, higher pairs are better to bet because they can get more value. But to be perfectly balanced, we want to have some top pairs in our range when we check, but also some lower pairs in our range when we bet. Another solution to make your life easier is to simplify your c-betting strategy. The easiest simplification is a range betting strategy, because just betting every hand doesn't require any additional thought. You don't have to think about which hands to bet and how to balance two different ranges. However, the question is this strategy good enough in terms of EV, so long-term profitability? Here, simplifying to a range bet for the most used bet size, 75% pot, loses 0.07 big blind, so around 1.4% of the pot compared to the original sim. Now the threshold for how much lost EV is acceptable isn't set in stone, but among other things depends on how much easier it is to play the simplified strategy, and on your estimation of how many mistakes you and your opponent would make in each scenario. But a general guideline is that an EV difference of less than 1% of the pot is a good number in most cases. So while the 1.4% here are higher than that 1%, there is also a different way to think about it. Because those 0.07 big blinds less in EV only hold true for a scenario in which the big blind perfectly adjusts against your range betting strategy. Which means primarily check raising more often than against a non-range bet. In reality though, not only will your opponent likely not know that you're playing a range bet strategy here, they can't just see it, because it would take a large sample size to detect it. They would also have to know that it would require them to check raise almost double the amount of hands against it. So if we assume our opponent to not adjust to our range bet, but to respond to a c-bet with the same strategy that would be optimal against the original strategy, we see that our EV loss goes down to only 0.02 big blinds, which is only 0.4% of the pot. But even that is actually being too generous towards the average regular in the big blind. What happens in practice is much worse. On medium-high boards in these positions, population on mid-stakes check raises a lot less often against the 75% pot bet than they should according to the solver, which means that betting more often is actually a much easier strategy and an exploit against population at the same time. On these stakes, however, you can expect your opponent to play closer to GTO and be able to adjust quicker, so Linus might just aim to play a mixed bet strategy. Kings with a heart are always a bet, and we get called. On the 5 of clubs, the hijack still has an advantage, but only in the top third of the range. Linus bet all his good and nut hands on the flop, so they all arrive at the turn. But he also bet some very weak hands which made it here. In contrary, some of Taisto's best hands would have check raised the flop, so he has less good and nut hands that made it to the turn. But he wouldn't check call the flop with pure air, so his worst hands are better than Linus's worst hands. And a polarized range against a medium strength range is a great spot for an overbet. Against this bet, the big blind would in theory fold almost 60% of hands. Only a few hands worse than top pair could call, and even those are sometimes folded. Some 2-pair and almost all sets are raised. Here, we must keep in mind that the players are 200 big blinds deep, so sets have an incentive to build the pot now to easily play for stacks on the river, which would be different with 100 big blind stacks, but more on that in a minute. We get another call and see the 5 of hearts on the river. And if you already clicked the check button in your mind, you'll want to see the following. On this river, kings with a heart could actually go for a bet most of the time. It would get called by a good amount of overpairs, top pairs, and even lower pairs in theory. But if you assume your opponent wouldn't call those, you could exploit them by overbluffing. Now, as mentioned, this hand is played 200 big blinds deep. And interestingly, when looking at the exact same simulation but 100 big blinds deep, the river would be a pure check back for pocket kings. Why? Well, for that, we have to go back to the turn. And here, we'll see that the big blind doesn't check raise all their sets, and also fewer flush draws than with 200 big blinds. Instead, pocket 8s would mostly, and pocket 10s would always just call the turn bet, because getting all the money in by the river happens much more often even without a turn raise. So with 100 blinds, the big blind will have more nut flushes and full houses on the river in this check call line. But in the same line with 200 big blinds, the fact that a turn raise is something we didn't see means we are facing a much weaker range on the river. And we can value bet thinner. Knowing which hands are in your opponent's range at any point in the hand is what good players try to do at all times. But what the real crushers also focus on is which hands are not. But that is not the only thing that makes you a crusher. To find out what makes a player you don't want to play against, watch this video next.